Hi, everyone. This is Barb Collura, and you're listening to Resolve's Kitchen Table Conversation. Our topic today is cancer and fertility preservation, and our head of the table sponsor is Legacy for this kitchen table conversation. And the kitchen table conversations is really a nod to our founder, Barbara Eck, who founded Resolve around her kitchen table in 1974. So what we do through these kitchen table conversations is bring together experts and patient voices and have important conversations about topics that matter to you. So I'm really excited because I get to do today's conversation with a very dear friend, so it doesn't really feel like work, and that is Joyce Reinecke. Joyce, welcome to our kitchen table. I've got a cup of tea here and you're in your kitchen, which is amazing. So you have, built just a long history of advocacy, professionally, personally, in the area of cancer, survivorship, fertility, all woven together. Take us back. Why is this issue important to you, and how did you get involved?
Well, I want to just thank you, Barb, for inviting me to have this conversation and for Resolve's commitment to fertility preservation, as a subset of infertility, something you've always been cognizant of, and we appreciate that so much. I was kind of brought into this space, I will say, probably a lot like you and many of the people that we work with, involuntarily, as a result of our own personal medical challenges. And for me, that began in my late 20s. I was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer out of the blue, quite shocking, and something I'd never thought about, heard about, living my life, and, building a career, was newly married, and found out, that I had cancer and had to suddenly learn a lot about what my life was going to look like, how, the medical establishment functioned, and all the things I needed to get in order to protect my health and my life going forward. And for me, a big part of that challenge during that time was learning that my planned course of treatment, which was going to be an aggressive chemotherapy, had, a strong potential of leaving me infertile and unable to have biological children. So that is what brought me into, this realm, and, out of my own personal experience and challenges, I saw a lot of the deficits from, the oncology world, from how this conversation was had or not, was not being had with patients, and from your own experience, I'm sure too, as many of the listeners, I'm sure, have gone through, when you have a medical challenge, people start to hear about it. Sometimes these things, and I'll say way back then, weren't always spoken about, and friends weren't open necessarily about their own challenges, but people start to come out of the woodwork. So people started to contact me, contact my parents, hear about what I had been through, and asked if I could help. Could I talk to, their son's fiance who now had Hodgkin's, and, all of these kinds of cases seemed to bubble up. And then, it started to sort of focus my attention and recognize that this was way beyond, my experience, and that this was happening to a lot of young people, and they weren't getting proper information about their potential infertility, about what to do about it, about how to fund, those services so that they might protect themselves, all of that. So anyway, that was what brought me to this place, and I've really, been involved ever since then.
How is your health? How are you doing?
Yeah, other than the normal, we've all been through COVID and, the past few years.
Growing old, right?
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, I've learned so much about, other aspects of health. But yeah, for me, I feel very fortunate. My cancer experience, was limited, frankly. I had my diagnosis. I got through that time of my life. I focused on doing fertility preservation, which entailed, creating embryos at that time. That was my only option, which we can talk about. And then since that time, though, I've not had a recurrence or anything. There's always a scare, there's always worries, there's always scans hanging over your head. But I feel fortunate to have put, I hope, that part of my medical challenges behind me.
yeah, okay, good. And you're a parent.
Yes. So for me, that threat of infertility was really, eye-opening and shocking. And as I said, I was married at the time. And so I was able to go with my husband and see fertility specialists and undergo essentially a round of IVF, right? And get, do hyperstimulation, get eggs out, freeze them. Before we froze them at that time, you had to create embryos. So we did that and we froze them and we had those safely put aside. And I was focused on my cancer treatment. And we chose to move forward with a surrogate, and we could not at that time foresee, when and if I would be healthy enough to carry, not need scans, not need further treatment. And so we did work with a surrogate and we ended up having twin daughters who are now in their 20s. So that has been rewarding. And again, it's another, area of my life where I feel very lucky that worked for me, that we did one cycle and that we had sufficient embryos. We did one transfer.
Oh my goodness.
And
I didn't realize it was just one of, you just had to do one. So gosh, your girls are in their early 20s. Of course, I know this, but you had that experience 20 years ago. You've now been a part of this space. What's changed? How is it different for somebody now diagnosed in 2023?
Yeah, honestly, I talk to people all the time. So now I'm at the Alliance for Fertility Preservation. Early, in this journey for me, I did have the good fortune of meeting up with Lindsay Beck, who founded Fertile Hope. And so that's the first place that I worked, and we worked on these issues of fertility preservation together, and then at Live Strong. And now at the Alliance. And so, over the course of these many years, I've probably been working in this space at least 15 years. I've talked to many, many patients at conferences, in person, at cancer centers, on the phone, through email. And I do think that patients are getting better information about this risk of infertility when they're diagnosed. And I do think that there are many more programs embedded in cancer centers that are focused on fertility, whether that's as a part of, what are called AYA programs, adolescent and young adult oncology programs. Those have grown up since I've been around. So there are many of those programs at nationally ranked cancer centers. And sometimes patients learn about these services through survivorship initiatives or survivorship programs at cancer centers that are, I think there are many more of those programs than existed when I was diagnosed, and they're a bit more holistic, right? They're looking at, I think, what the needs of that patient will be when they survive their cancer, instead of being so head down on just treatment.
And the treatment options for fertility preservation, have those changed for people today than they were 20 years ago?
Absolutely. So not only do I think cancer patients are getting this information earlier and they're getting more thorough information about fertility, the fertility services that are available to them have proliferated. I think the main driver of that has been the change in technology around egg freezing. So, as I said, when I was diagnosed as a woman, my only choice was to freeze embryos. That's all that really could be done at that time. And now the technology around egg freezing is so much better that you can go to virtually any fertility clinic in the country and freeze eggs. And so I think for patients, especially younger patients, you can imagine if someone is a teenage girl diagnosed,
Right.
they're not really going to be that keen on picking out, a
Sperm donor, right.
donor and
Yeah.
doing all that in the midst of
Right.
cancer treatment, right?
Yeah.
So that's changed a lot. There are also newer options available now for prepubescent patients. So there used to not be anything really available at all for girls before puberty. And now there is a technique called ovarian tissue freezing that is considered a standard technology. So increasingly we're seeing children's hospitals add this service for their patients so that they can have some preservation done before they would start sterilizing treatment, even if they're a child. And similar technology is being researched and worked on for boys, which is testicular tissue cryopreservation, but that is still considered experimental.
Wow. So much going on. So thinking back to, when you were diagnosed, and I'm thinking about when people first hear those words, you have cancer. You've got all of these complicated feelings and emotions, especially when you're young, and you have your whole life ahead of you. And quite honestly, you may not be thinking about your future fertility. You were married, but you and I both know a lot of people who've been diagnosed, and we've advocated together, 18, 19, 20 years old, right? They're not married. And when you think about that, what would you say to them should be the first steps, the first things that they think about regarding fertility when it's, again, not necessarily front and center?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and a great point to make. I do think that there are a lot of studies out there that show that, this isn't something necessarily that teenage patients are focused on. But backward looking, studies do show some levels of regret if this is something that wasn't addressed or thought about. So I would say maybe more to the caregivers in those people's lives that that this is something maybe you need to think about for them, or the adults that are around you. I would encourage teenagers, I guess, to understand and try the best that you can at that time to think about what you would envision for your future life. Like, is parenthood something that you might one day want to hold open as an option, right? So it's more, I think, for those patients, it gives hope for the future, first of all. And I think if people are able to reflect on their own relationships with their parents, with siblings, they may be able to put a little bit of thinking around this, or try to start to think about what they value for the future. It is very abstract. I will say that, and I'll say that for myself as a married person, Barb. I was focused on my career at that time. We weren't in the process of family building at that time.
Right.
I think until my children were born, I really didn't have a great sense of what that loss would have been.
Sure. Well, you and I have advocated alongside a young woman. It's been a few years now, but in New York, who I think was diagnosed when she was like 18 with cancer. And it was her dad who was in the meeting with the oncologist. She was, of course, in the meeting with her parents. And her dad said, will she ever be able to have kids? And, then they were like, no. And, oh, well then, so yeah, I think it's more for the parents who might be hearing you. So Joyce, I mentioned advocacy. You have, as you mentioned, had this career working for a number of organizations doing advocacy. We Resolve gave the Alliance for Fertility Preservation our Hope Award for Advocacy and our Night of Hope in 2022. We were in person, which was very exciting. And it was so well deserved. You have done such amazing work at the Alliance. This is being recorded in March of 2023. What is it that you do from an advocacy perspective? Maybe just kind of briefly share what is it you're advocating for and kind of where do things stand?
Yeah, thank you so much. You're right. I have worked for, several organizations that I mentioned, Fertile Hope and Live Strong, and now the Alliance. And advocacy has always been a part of that in a soft, sort of generic way, if you will, in that we've always been dedicated at those organizations to speaking out for patients and trying to get patients information that they don't even know that they need, right, when they're diagnosed, because that's a challenge. But I will say, when all of this started for me, the idea of actually being an advocate and fighting for insurance coverage in particular to cover these services was not really even something that was on the table, right?
So insurance doesn't cover people's the medical procedures to freeze sperm, freeze egg, freeze embryos if you're dealing with, like a cancer diagnosis. You're telling our listeners that was something that was not that's not been covered.
Absolutely. So historically, and, by and large, even today, most insurance does not cover sperm banking, egg banking, embryo banking, tissue banking, those services that someone needs in an urgent manner, right? It has to have immediately before they start any potentially sterilizing treatment, such as chemotherapy, such as radiation, and especially in circumstances where someone's having a bone marrow transplant, let's say, full body irradiation, that is, under most circumstances going to leave them sterile. So those services, the way that we've come to view them at our organization is, very much akin to other side effects of cancer treatment.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, which are typically covered, part and parcel of cancer treatment is if you need anti-nausea medication,
right,
you need prosthetics, or you need something that to fix something that is caused by your treatment, that too is covered generally. So that's the argument, that we've been leaning into, and we believe is just, that
absolutely.
You would have. And I think what's changed too, Barb, over time is that as we said, these techniques, they weren't all readily available. And it used to mean, for me, for instance, to go through an embryo freezing cycle, that was like a 6.5 week process, right? And now the techniques that have been developed to ramp someone up and get them through that process, can be done much more quickly, probably within 2 weeks.
So you're advocating for insurance coverage to cover fertility preservation services. You're doing that at the state level. You and I and Resolve and Alliance and ASRM are also doing it at the federal level. We're doing it with the military. We're doing it with, you did it with federal employees. So you have some states right now that have passed these laws. And so I think that the message there is we need a lot more states to pass those laws, and they can get involved. They can get involved with you and the work that you're doing at the Alliance. Is that something that you need and want?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I know that we've spent some of this time talking about what's gotten better. And I think, information and disclosure and options, all of those things have gotten better. And what we think is the most fundamental remaining barrier to these services for patients is the cost.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
just, I mean, the way things are
Yeah.
structured in the US, like, I mean,
Right.
basically insurance equals access, right? So if you did not have
Exactly.
insurance coverage for your knee replacement, you're not going to be able to do that surgery.
Well, or
right?
you go into bankruptcy or something like that. But I think people are already looking at a cancer treatment and diagnosis, and they're expecting their insurance to cover all of that. And they're, they may be surprised at something that might not be, but then to find out that this isn't, it's just probably, plus it's not, when you're doing, I used to write these financial planning articles for Resolve on how to plan for an IVF. You can't plan for fertility preservation with a cancer diagnosis, right? That's not something like, you know what, let me save up over the next 6 months and I'll come back. No. So that's a really tough thing. When I'm sure you get this a lot from people, because I want to kind of wrap up and kind of think about your words of wisdom and your words of advice. What's a hope or a wish that you have for people facing a cancer diagnosis and they're in those, we call them reproductive years, but in those family building years?
Yeah, I mean, my hope and my vision for the future will be that there will be a day maybe that you'll invite me to this conversation, Barb, and we'll look back and we'll say, oh my gosh, do you remember when we had that kitchen table conversation about how there was no insurance coverage? Can you believe that was the way it was? So I hope one day this is in the rear view mirror, and there are so many elements to this care that I know in discussions with our medical advisors and our staff and our board that we would like to address. We want to get into the nuances of how do you speak about this in a compassionate way, or how do you discern what someone's value is for having children or what they want to go through. But we can't do that, and we can't refine these discussions, and we can't do better and reach more people until we get this access point open. Right. And so that's my hope, that one day we'll be talking about other things, how to do this really well, how to make sure every cancer patient knows this,
God, wouldn't it be great to talk about something else other than insurance coverage for something that seems so basic? And as you said, we cover all of these other things as part of cancer care. You and I could go on and on and on, like, why is it that this is the thing that's still not covered, and all of that. But I just applaud you for your perseverance, but also your passion and compassion, because I know the compassion that you have for all of the people coming after you, that you want to see a much easier path for everybody, and that this is, quite honestly, the least of their worries when they get that cancer diagnosis. And yet you and I know how some people say this was actually worse than the cancer diagnosis was finding out I'm never ever going to be a parent, or have children, or however they looked at it. So thank you for your advocacy. Thank you for sharing your story with us. Thank you for helping enlighten people on the complexities of this, but also where we've come a long way, and we still have a ways to go, but we're not giving up. I know you're not, and so appreciate everything that you have done and that continue to do.
Thank you, Barb, and again, thank you for your friendship and for your partnership, and everything that we do, we work hand in hand with you guys, and we thank Resolve for always keeping our patients in mind.
And we thank you for listening, and you can find more resources at resolve.org. Thank you.